The morning of June 6, 1944. Normandy, France. Private First Class Donald Burgett gripped the edge of the open door of his C-47 Skytrain as the aircraft banked hard over the Cotentin Peninsula. Through the doorway, tracers streaked upward like strings of glowing pearls. The altimeter in the cockpit read 600 feet, the prescribed altitude for paratrooper drops, but anti-aircraft fire from German positions forced the pilot's hand. The aircraft dove sharply, 500 feet, 400, 350. The green light flashed. Burgett threw himself into darkness. The opening shock hit like a sledgehammer, ripping his musette bag clean off. Before he could process what happened, his boots struck Norman earth. From exit to ground contact, barely 30 seconds had passed. What thousands of American paratroopers discovered in the chaos over Normandy would revolutionize airborne warfare forever. The carefully calculated 600-foot jump altitude, perfected through years of training at Fort Benning, had collided with battlefield reality. Enemy fire forced pilots lower, weather scattered formations, confusion reigned. Yet paradoxically, the paratroopers who jumped at these dangerously low altitudes achieved something unexpected. They landed faster, scattered less, and reached objectives more effectively than higher altitude drops ever could. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics of parachute deployment seem to favor high-altitude jumps absolutely. Throughout training from 1940 to 1943, American airborne doctrine emphasized 600 feet as the minimum safe altitude. At this height, the T-4 and T-5 parachutes had time to deploy fully. The canopy opened. The suspension lines stretched taut. The paratrooper descended at roughly 16 feet per second, providing 40 seconds under canopy to assess the drop zone, prepare for landing, and execute a proper parachute landing fall. Training instructors at Fort Benning emphasized this doctrine relentlessly. Lieutenant William Ryder, who commanded the 1st Army Parachute Test Platoon in 1940, designed the training regimen that American airborne forces would follow throughout the war. He insisted every soldier pack his own parachute, which he claimed inspired confidence in the paratroopers. The 34-foot towers he constructed, nicknamed by his men as Ryder's Slide of Death, simulated exit procedures. The 250-foot towers, purchased from the 1939 New York World's Fair, provided realistic descent training. On August 16, 1940, the test platoon made their first jumps from a Douglas B-18 Bolo bomber at 1,500 feet over Lawson Field. This higher altitude provided margin for error, time for equipment malfunction correction, opportunity for reserve parachute deployment if needed. As training evolved, the standard altitude decreased to 1,200 feet for routine training jumps, then to 600 feet for combat simulation. This 600-foot standard represented a careful balance between safety and tactical necessity. Above 600 feet, paratroopers spent too long exposed to enemy fire during descent. Below 600 feet, parachutes might not fully deploy before ground impact. The T-4 parachute, 28 feet in diameter, deployed in a specific sequence. When paratroopers leapt from their plane, the static line parachute automatically deployed the top of the parachute from their backpack and released the canopy followed by the rigging lines. This canopy-first deployment sequence required altitude to work properly. At 600 feet, everything functioned as designed. American doctrine differed fundamentally from German airborne practices. German paratroopers jumped at the absolute lowest altitudes, 60 to 100 meters, just enough for the canopy to open and have a minimal canopy ride. The German RZ parachute opened violently, often causing injuries, but delivered soldiers to Earth in seconds. American planners rejected this approach. They believed the additional time under canopy at 600 feet provided tactical advantages that outweighed the increased exposure to ground fire. The first indication that doctrine might need revision came during Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. High winds, poor navigation, and friendly anti-aircraft fire badly disrupted the jumps of the 82nd Airborne Division's 505th and 504th Parachute Infantry Regiments, scattering troopers across the Sicilian countryside. On the night of July 11th, 144 C-47s and C-53s lifted off from unpaved, dust-strewn runways around Kairouan, Tunisia. They cruised at 400 feet, the altitude at which drops were made. The decision to fly at 400 feet resulted from tactical necessity, not doctrine. German aircraft had been attacking the invasion fleet all day, flying low reduced visibility from German fighters and anti-aircraft batteries on the ground. What happened next became the worst friendly fire incident in American military history. Allied naval vessels and shore troops mistook the C-47s for German bombers and opened fire. 23 transport planes were shot down. 318 American soldiers were killed or wounded. Yet amid this catastrophe, a crucial lesson emerged. The paratroopers who jumped at 400 feet landed remarkably close to their intended drop zones. Those who survived the friendly fire reached their assembly points faster than troops dropped from higher altitudes in previous operations. The reduced time under canopy meant less drift from wind. The rapid descent provided less opportunity for disorientation. Soldiers hit the ground while still focused and aggressive, not after 40 seconds of watching tracer fire arc toward them. Colonel James Gavin, commanding the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, noted this phenomenon in his after-action reports. Paratroopers dropped at lower altitudes, despite the chaos and friendly fire, assembled more quickly as cohesive fighting units. They reached their objectives faster, they engaged the enemy with more immediate violence of action. The correlation seemed counterintuitive, yet the evidence was undeniable. Lower altitude meant faster consolidation. The preparation for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, brought these lessons into sharp focus. Normal parameters for dropping paratroopers were 600 feet of altitude at 90 miles per hour airspeed. Planning staffs at 1st Allied Airborne Army Headquarters in England calculated drop zones, flight paths, and timing based on these parameters. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions would jump inland from the beaches, seize key bridges and crossroads, and disrupt German communications before dawn. 18 Pathfinder teams would jump first, marking drop zones with lights and radar beacons. The serials took off beginning at 22:30 on June 5th, assembled into formations, and flew south to the departure point. There they descended and flew southwest over the English Channel at 500 feet mean sea level to remain below German radar coverage. The plan called for aircraft to climb to 600 feet over the drop zones, discharge their paratroopers, then descend again for the return flight. Reality shattered planning the moment. Aircraft crossed the French coast. German anti-aircraft batteries opened fire immediately. Flak from German anti-aircraft guns resulted in planes either going under or over their prescribed altitudes. Pilots took evasive action. Some climbed to escape the fire. Others dove even lower, owing to weather and tactical conditions. Many troopers were dropped from 300 to 2,100 feet, and at speeds as high as 150 miles per hour. Some of the men who jumped from planes at lower altitudes were injured when they hit the ground because of their chutes not having enough time to slow their descent, while others who jumped from higher altitudes reported a terrifying descent of several minutes, watching tracer fire streaking up towards them. The higher drops gave German gunners time to track and engage descending paratroopers. The lower drops minimized exposure but increased ground impact forces. Private Donald Burgett of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, jumped from an aircraft flying at approximately 350 feet. His account, published decades later in his memoir Currahee, described the violent opening shock. The opening shock was so great, it ripped equipment off paratroopers. Musette bags tore away. Leg bags containing weapons and ammunition snapped free. Yet Burgett landed within seconds of exiting the aircraft. He hit the ground hard but combat-ready, oriented, aggressive. Across the Cotentin Peninsula, similar scenes repeated thousands of times. Because of wide dispersion over the Cotentin Peninsula, only about 1/3 of the American paratroopers assembled themselves under organized leadership, and many landed in the wrong divisional areas. Yet those who jumped at lower altitudes, despite the increased injury risk, often consolidated faster than troops dropped from standard 600-foot altitude. The tactical advantages of low-altitude drops became apparent through the chaos of D-Day. Paratroopers scattered across Normandy displayed the initiative expected of elite troops. One battalion commander roamed alone for 5 days, killing 6 Germans without finding another American. While some troopers sought cover or got drunk on Calvados wine, many others displayed the initiative expected of elite troops. Those who landed from low-altitude drops hit the ground already in fighting mode. The abbreviated descent time didn't allow for fear to build or focus to waver. Staff Sergeant Jake McNeice of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment later explained the psychological impact. Jumping at 600 feet gave a paratrooper 40 seconds to think, to worry, to watch tracers. Jumping at 400 feet provided 25 seconds, sometimes less. The mind didn't have time to process fear. You exited the aircraft, felt the opening shock, oriented yourself, and immediately hit ground. There was no contemplation phase, no extended terror, just action. The engineering reality of the T5 parachute system supported this tactical observation. The T4 and T5 static line parachutes deployed the canopy, followed by the rigging lines. This deployment sequence, while slower than ideal for very low-altitude drops, still functioned at altitudes as low as 300 feet. Injuries occurred, certainly. Equipment was lost, but the parachute opened, and paratroopers reached the ground alive and capable of fighting. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The lessons from Normandy reinforced what Sicily had suggested. Lower altitude drops, while more dangerous during the jump itself, produced tactical advantages on the ground. Faster assembly, more immediate violence of action, less drift from drop zones. The question facing American airborne commanders by summer 1944 was whether to codify these lessons into revised doctrine or maintain the 600-foot standard as the baseline. General James Gavin, now commanding the 82nd Airborne Division, advocated for tactical flexibility. He argued that 600 feet should remain the training standard and doctrinal baseline, but in combat, circumstances dictated altitude. If German fire forced aircraft lower, paratroopers should be prepared to jump at 400 feet, even 300 if necessary. The key was training soldiers to expect the unexpected, to handle the violent opening shock, to maintain combat effectiveness regardless of drop altitude. The training modifications began immediately after Normandy. At Fort Benning, Georgia, the Airborne School adjusted its curriculum. The Air Force aircraft fly at 1,250 feet above the ground at an airspeed of about 113 knots during training jumps. This remained the standard for routine qualification jumps, but advanced training now included instruction on low-altitude emergency procedures. Instructors emphasized the violent opening shock paratroopers would experience at lower altitudes and higher aircraft speeds. They taught proper body position during exit to minimize equipment loss. They drilled parachute landing fall techniques for harder impacts. The goal was preparing soldiers psychologically and physically for jumps that deviated from the textbook 600-foot standard. The development of low-altitude jump doctrine occurred gradually through operational necessity. During Operation Market Garden in September 1944, Allied airborne forces conducted the largest airborne operation of the war. Operation Market Garden employed all 3 divisions of 1st Allied Airborne Army, with some 35,000 parachute and glider troops involved in the operation. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions jumped into Holland to seize bridges over the Maas, Waal, and Rhine rivers. The jumps over Holland occurred in daylight, unlike the night drops over Normandy. The US jump into Holland during Operation Market Garden was near perfect and carried out in daylight. Aircraft flew at prescribed altitudes without the chaos of night operations or intensive anti-aircraft fire during the initial drops. Yet, even in these improved conditions, the lessons from low-altitude drops influenced tactics. Pilots maintained lower approach altitudes to reduce exposure time over drop zones. They climbed to jump altitude only at the last moment, released their paratroopers, then descended immediately. This pop-up technique minimized the time aircraft spent at vulnerable altitudes. It also meant paratroopers exited closer to 400 to 500 feet, rather than the doctrinal 600 feet. First Lieutenant Alphonse Chikansky, jumping with the 376th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion during Market Garden, experienced the consequences of even minor altitude variations. As he descended under his open parachute canopy, he was struck in the back of the head by a 300-pound equipment bundle. The bundle, released from the same aircraft, descended faster than a paratrooper under canopy and caught up to him during the brief fall. At higher altitudes, such collisions were less likely. At lower altitudes, the compressed time frame brought all airborne objects to Earth in rapid succession. The material reality of parachute operations at low altitude demanded different techniques. Many D-Day troopers carried nearly 200 pounds of equipment, including their main and reserve chutes, life preserver, primary and secondary weapons and ammunition, water and rations, radios or mines, and other gear. This load, manageable during a 40-second descent from 600 feet, became punishing during a 25-second plunge from 400 feet. The opening shock at 400 feet, especially if the aircraft flew above 90 miles per hour, could exceed 6 times the force of gravity. The opening shock was so great, it ripped musette bags off, helmets were pushed over faces, rifles tore from grasps, canteens and pistols ripped away from their fastenings. Soldiers learned to secure equipment differently. They tied additional knots. They used stronger webbing. They distributed weight to reduce stress on any single attachment point. The leg bag, a canvas container suspended by rope beneath the paratrooper and released just before landing to dangle 15 feet below, proved particularly problematic at low altitudes. The violent opening shock tore leg bags off, along with virtually every bit of equipment some paratroopers were carrying. If the bag released prematurely during opening shock, the soldier lost his primary weapon, ammunition, and mission-essential equipment before reaching the ground. If the bag didn't release properly, the soldier landed with an additional 70 pounds, striking the earth simultaneously with his body. Engineers at the Army Air Force's Materiel Command studied these problems throughout 1944 and into 1945. They experimented with modified deployment sequences. The T-4 parachute deployed the canopy, followed by the rigging lines. Engineers recognized the limitations because the parachute deployed before the rigging, causing various issues. Ideally, for very low altitude drops, the canopy and lines should deploy simultaneously to minimize descent time. The T-7 parachute, introduced late in the war, attempted to address some deployment issues. A parachute optimized for 600-foot deployment provided suboptimal performance at 400 feet. A parachute designed specifically for 400-foot drops would be inadequate at 600 feet. American doctrine chose the compromise position design for 600 feet, train for flexibility, accept the limitations of low-altitude emergency drops. The Germans, conversely, had designed their entire system around very low-altitude drops. The German RZ parachute rig opened violently, often causing injuries to paratroopers, but delivered them to Earth in mere seconds with minimal canopy ride. German Fallschirmjäger jumped without reserve. Parachutes carried weapons in separate containers that dropped alongside them and expected to fight immediately upon landing. Their doctrine accepted high injury rates during the jump in exchange for rapid ground consolidation. American paratroopers, by contrast, carried reserve parachutes strapped to their chests. Americans were the only airborne troops in World War II to use a reserve parachute. It rested below their chest toward their stomach and could be pulled in case of a malfunction. This safety feature added weight and bulk but provided psychological reassurance. At 600 feet, a paratrooper had time to recognize a malfunction and deploy the reserve. At 400 feet, recognition time compressed to perhaps 10 seconds. At 300 feet, reserve deployment became effectively impossible. The tactical doctrine that emerged from 2 years of combat operations represented a synthesis of training ideals and battlefield reality. Official doctrine maintained 600 feet as the minimum safe altitude for mass tactical jumps. Training continued at 1,250 feet for qualification jumps, but operational orders for combat jumps included provisions for altitude adjustments based on enemy activity, weather, and terrain. The phrase that appeared in operations orders was minimum 400 feet, or as circumstances permit. This language gave pilots and jump masters discretion. If anti-aircraft fire threatened the formation, descend to 400 feet. If weather obscured the drop zone, climb to 600 feet for better visibility. If the tactical situation demanded immediate delivery of troops, accept 350 feet as the absolute minimum. A World War II paratrooper veteran later reminded modern soldiers that he jumped from only 400 to 600 feet from the ground, instead of the 1,200 feet that today's paratroopers exit the aircraft from. This difference represented the evolution from combat necessity to peacetime training standards. Modern doctrine prioritized safety during training. Wartime doctrine prioritized mission accomplishment while accepting higher risk. The psychological transformation required to jump at 400 feet proved more challenging than the physical preparation. Paratroopers at Fort Benning trained on 34-foot towers and 250-foot towers. The 34-foot towers simulated exit technique. The 250-foot towers provided realistic descent experience. Neither truly prepared soldiers for the compression of time during a 400-foot combat jump. Staff sergeants and platoon leaders emphasized mental preparation. They told their men the opening shock would feel like being hit by a truck. They explained equipment would tear free despite best efforts to secure it. They described the ground rushing up faster than expected. They trained paratroopers to trust the parachute, trust their training, and focus on the mission rather than the fear. The climax of the low-altitude tactical revolution occurred not during a single dramatic operation, but through the accumulated experience of dozens of combat jumps from 1943 through 1945. In Sicily, chaos forced low-altitude drops. In Normandy, enemy fire compelled altitude adjustments. In Holland, tactical considerations led to deliberate reduction of jump altitudes. By late 1944, American airborne commanders understood low-altitude jumps weren't emergency procedures, they were operational reality. The 17th Airborne Division, committed to combat during Operation Varsity in March 1945, incorporated these lessons into its training from the beginning. The division trained for jumps at altitudes ranging from 350 to 600 feet. Soldiers practiced equipment securement for violent opening shocks. They drilled immediate action after landing, assuming equipment loss. They internalized the understanding that combat jumps rarely matched training conditions. Operation Varsity, the airborne assault across the Rhine River on March 24, 1945, demonstrated the maturity of American airborne doctrine. Combat jumps are at low altitude, 400 to 500 feet, and normally carried out a short distance away from the target area at night, or directly on if lightly defended. The 17th Airborne jumped in daylight, at altitudes between 400 and 550 feet, into drop zones under direct enemy fire. The compressed time from exit to ground contact proved devastating to German defenders. Paratroopers landed already fighting. There was no extended descent phase during which defenders could reposition. German soldiers reported seeing aircraft, then immediately seeing American paratroopers on the ground. The time compression eliminated the defenders' observation decision action cycle. By the time German troops recognized the threat and attempted to respond, American paratroopers were already organized and attacking. The cost of low-altitude operations remained significant. Injury rates during jumps increased. Some men who jumped from planes at lower altitudes were injured when they hit the ground because of their chutes not having enough time to slow their descent. Broken ankles, fractured ribs, concussions, these injuries spiked when drop altitudes fell below 500 feet. But commanders calculated these casualties against the tactical advantages gained. A paratrooper who broke his ankle landing from 350 feet but reached his objective in 20 seconds contributed more to mission success than an uninjured paratrooper who descended for 40 seconds from 600 feet, drifted half a mile from the drop zone, and required an hour to reach his objective. The mathematics were brutal but clear. Low-altitude drops, despite higher injury rates, produced better tactical outcomes. The evolution of American airborne doctrine reflected broader patterns in military innovation. Technology, the parachute, the transport aircraft, the static line deployment system provided capabilities, doctrine the 600-foot standard, the training regimen, the equipment specifications attempted to codify best practices. Combat the chaos of Sicily, the fire over Normandy, the complexity of Holland revealed gaps between doctrine and reality. Successful militaries adapted. They preserved core principles while adjusting specific techniques. They maintained training standards while preparing soldiers for deviations. They balanced safety with effectiveness. American airborne forces achieved this balance better than any other nation's paratroopers during World War II. The aftermath of the war saw continuation and refinement of these lessons. The 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team made 2 combat jumps in Korea during the Korean War. The first combat jump was made on October 20, 1950, at Suncheon and Sukcheon, North Korea. The second combat jump was made on March 21, 1951, at Munsan-ni, South Korea. Both operations employed low-altitude drop techniques refined during World War II. Korean War airborne operations confirmed what World War II had demonstrated. Low-altitude drops provided tactical advantages that outweighed the risks. The 187th Airborne jumped at altitudes between 400 and 500 feet. Paratroopers landed in seconds, consolidated rapidly, and struck objectives before North Korean and Chinese forces could mount effective resistance. The compressed timeline from aircraft to ground contact remained the decisive factor. Vietnam continued the evolution. Though large-scale combat jumps didn't occur in Southeast Asia, American Special Forces and reconnaissance units conducted small unit insertions using high-altitude, low-opening techniques. These halo insertions inverted the altitude equation, jumping from 30,000 feet or higher, free-falling to minimize time under canopy, deploying parachutes at the last possible moment. The principle remained constant: minimize time under canopy, maximize tactical surprise. The technological advancement that finally resolved the low-altitude deployment challenge came decades after World War II. During World War II, American paratroopers were able to jump at extremely low altitudes due to the T-4 and T-7 parachutes canopy and lines at the same time opening sequence. But post-war parachute development prioritized different characteristics. The 10 parachute, introduced in the 1950s, used a lines-first deployment sequence that improved reliability but required more altitude. Modern 10D parachutes are not reliable under 500 feet, yet today's lines opening first parachutes require more altitude than the World War II-era canopy and lines simultaneous systems. This represented a conscious trade-off. Modern doctrine accepted the altitude requirement in exchange for dramatically improved reliability. Combat jumps in the jet age would occur at 500 to 1,250 feet, with peacetime training at 1,250 feet as standard. The legacy of World War II low-altitude tactics extended far beyond parachute design. The psychological preparation developed during the war training soldiers to function effectively in compressed timeline. High-stress situations became fundamental to all special operations forces. Whether jumping from aircraft, fast roping from helicopters, or conducting direct action raids, the principle remained: train for the ideal, prepare for the chaotic, execute under any conditions. Modern airborne units trace their lineage directly to the soldiers who jumped at 400 feet over Normandy. The 82nd Airborne Division, the 101st Airborne Division, the 173rd Airborne Brigade all maintain the standards established during World War II. They train at 1,250 feet. They prepare for jumps at any altitude from 300 to 1,500 feet. They understand doctrine provides the baseline, but combat demands flexibility. The statistical impact of low-altitude jumps during World War II proved difficult to quantify precisely. Casualty reports combined combat injuries with jump injuries. After-action reports described scattered drops without quantifying whether scatter resulted from altitude, wind, pilot error, or enemy fire. But certain patterns emerged clearly from the historical record. Operations conducted at altitudes below 500 feet consistently showed faster assembly times. Units dropped at 400 feet reached 50% strength at assembly points, an average of 15 minutes faster than units dropped at 600 feet. This time, advantage translated directly to tactical success. 15 minutes could mean seizing a bridge before demolition charges detonated. 15 minutes could mean establishing defensive positions before enemy counterattack. 15 minutes could mean survival. The human cost was real. Paratroopers who jumped at low altitudes sustained more jump-related injuries. Broken bones, sprains, concussions. These injuries occurred at perhaps twice the rate of higher altitude jumps. But combat-related casualties showed the inverse relationship. Units that assembled quickly and struck objectives rapidly sustained fewer casualties from enemy action. The compressed timeline provided less opportunity for enemy forces to organize effective resistance. General James Gavin, reflecting on airborne operations in his post-war memoirs, emphasized this balance. Low-altitude jumps were more dangerous during the jump itself. They were safer during the subsequent combat. The paratrooper, who landed hard but fought immediately, faced less cumulative risk than the paratrooper who landed gently, but spent an hour wandering lost before finding his unit. The doctrinal publications issued by the Army Airborne School in the late 1940s codified these lessons. Field Manual 3-61, Parachute Infantry Regiment, specified 600 feet as the minimum safe altitude for administrative and training jumps. It specified altitude as tactically appropriate, minimum 400 feet for combat operations. This language acknowledged reality while maintaining safety standards for peacetime training. The evolution of drop zone selection reflected low-altitude tactics as well. During early airborne operations, planners selected large, clear drop zones to allow for drift and dispersion. By late 1944, planners selected smaller drop zones closer to objectives, accepting higher obstacle density in exchange for reduced post-landing movement requirements. This shift only made sense in the context of low-altitude drops. At 400 feet, drift was minimal. Paratroopers landed in tighter patterns. Smaller drop zones became tactically viable. The transformation of airborne warfare from 1940 to 1945 represented one of the most rapid doctrinal evolutions in military history. In August 1940, the Army Parachute Test Platoon made its first jumps from 1,500 feet, seeking maximum safety margins. By March 1945, entire divisions jumped routinely at 400 feet, accepting significant risks in pursuit of tactical advantage. This evolution occurred through blood and experience, not theoretical study. Every major airborne operation contributed lessons. Sicily taught that altitude flexibility was essential. Normandy demonstrated that low-altitude drops, despite chaos, produced tactical results. Holland showed that even in ideal conditions, lower altitudes improved outcomes. Varsity proved that mature low-altitude doctrine could be executed successfully by newly formed divisions. The learning curve was steep, paid for in casualties, but the knowledge gained proved invaluable. The international influence of American low-altitude doctrine extended throughout NATO and beyond. British airborne forces, initially skeptical of American techniques, adopted modified versions after observing results in Normandy and Holland. French airborne units formed after the war trained under American advisors and incorporated low-altitude tactics from inception. Even Soviet airborne forces, developed independently, converged on similar altitude parameters through parallel experience. The principle underlying low-altitude jumps, minimize time of maximum vulnerability, applies across military operations far beyond airborne warfare. Helicopter assaults minimize time in the landing zone. Amphibious operations emphasize rapid transition from ship to shore. Special operations raids emphasize speed and surprise over deliberate movement. All these doctrines echo the lesson learned by paratroopers over Normandy. The faster you move through the danger zone, the higher your probability of survival. The memorial ceremonies conducted annually at drop zones across Europe honor the paratroopers who pioneered these tactics. At Sainte-Mère-Église in Normandy, at Grave in Holland, at the Rhine crossing sites in Germany, veterans and active duty soldiers commemorate the jumps. Modern paratroopers, jumping from C-130s and C-17s at 1,250 feet, understand they follow a tradition forged by men who jumped from 400 feet into darkness and fire. The cost of developing low-altitude doctrine deserves recognition equal to its tactical achievements. Thousands of American paratroopers died or were wounded during combat jumps. Some died from jump injuries, chutes that failed to open, collisions in mid-air, hard landings that proved fatal. More died from enemy fire during descent or immediately after landing. The 30-second window from exit to ground contact, while tactically advantageous, offered no guarantee of survival. The soldiers who jumped at low altitude in combat faced fears their training could only partially address. Standing in the door of a C-47, watching tracers arc upward, knowing you had perhaps 20 seconds from exit to impact, this required courage of a specific type. Not the courage to face a known danger, but the courage to hurl yourself into chaos with no control over the outcome. You jumped. The parachute opened, or it didn't. You landed in the drop zone or somewhere else. You survived or you didn't. The only certainty was that within 30 seconds, you would know. Staff Sergeant Curtis Gadd of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, who made 4 combat jumps during the war, described the psychology. High-altitude jumps, he said, gave time to be afraid. You exited the aircraft. The chute opened. You hung in the harness, watching the ground approach, watching the tracers, thinking about all the things that could go wrong. Low-altitude jumps denied that time. You exited. You felt the shock. You hit the ground. Fear didn't have time to establish itself before action began. This psychological compression, as much as the tactical advantages, made low-altitude jumps effective. Paratroopers landed already in combat mode. There was no transition from descent to engagement. You landed fighting. The Germans, defending against these drops, reported the phenomenon repeatedly. American paratroopers seemed to reach the ground already aggressive, already oriented, already attacking. The defenders had no time to exploit the traditional vulnerability of airborne forces during landing. German after-action reports from Normandy emphasized this observation. Fallschirmjäger officers, veterans of German airborne operations, noted that American paratroopers behaved differently than expected. German doctrine assumed paratroopers would require several minutes after landing to organize and orient. American paratroopers, particularly those from low-altitude drops, fought immediately. The compressed timeline produced immediate combat effectiveness. The recognition that low-altitude jumps provided tactical advantages came gradually to German intelligence throughout 1944. Reports from frontline units described increasingly effective American airborne operations. Luftwaffe intelligence analyzed the tactics. They understood the Americans were jumping at lower altitudes than doctrine suggested. They recognized the advantages this provided, but by the time German forces could adapt, air superiority belonged entirely to the Allies. German transport aircraft couldn't approach drop zones without being shot down. The tactical insights proved irrelevant when operational capability ceased to exist. The fundamental innovation making low-altitude parachute operations successful was not technological, but psychological and tactical. The T-4 and T-5 parachutes were capable machines, but not revolutionary compared to systems used by other nations. What changed was the willingness to accept risk during the jump in exchange for advantage on the ground. This calculus trading safety during insertion for effectiveness after landing became characteristic of American special operations throughout the Cold War and beyond. Modern special operations forces apply this principle constantly. Halo insertions accept the risks of high-altitude hypoxia and equipment failure to achieve surprise. Combat rubber raiding craft accept the risks of small boat operations to achieve beach penetration. Direct action raids accept the risks of immediate contact to achieve surprise. The thread connecting all these tactics runs back to paratroopers over Normandy, who chose to jump at 400 feet, despite the dangers. The story of American pilots and paratroopers developing low-altitude jump tactics exemplifies the constant evolution of warfare. Doctrine provides structure, training provides skills. But combat reveals truth. The 600-foot jump altitude, perfected through years of training, proved inadequate when confronted with enemy fire, weather, and chaos. Adaptation occurred not through headquarters directive but through frontline soldiers making split-second decisions. Pilots dove their aircraft to avoid flak. Paratroopers jumped anyway. They discovered the violent opening shock could be survived. They found the rapid descent provided advantages. They learned to fight immediately upon landing. These lessons, accumulated through dozens of operations and thousands of individual jumps, eventually became doctrine. But the doctrine followed practice, not the reverse. The sacrifice these paratroopers made deserves continued recognition. They volunteered for duty that was dangerous during training and frequently fatal during combat. They jumped into darkness, into fire, into chaos, knowing the odds were poor. Many never returned. They died in aircraft shot down before reaching drop zones. They died when parachutes malfunctioned. They died from landing injuries. They died in the first seconds of combat after landing. They lie buried in military cemeteries across Europe and North Africa. The American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer in Normandy contains thousands of airborne soldiers. The Netherlands-American cemetery at Margareton holds paratroopers from Market Garden. The Sicily-Rome-American cemetery memorializes those lost during Operation Husky. Their individual stories are often lost, but their collective achievement remains undeniable. They proved that aggressive tactics could overcome doctrinal limitations. They demonstrated that accepting risk during insertion could reduce overall casualties. They showed that rapid action immediately after landing could overcome numerical disadvantage. They validated the principle that time compression in the danger zone increases survival probability. These lessons, written in blood, shaped American military doctrine for generations. The officers who commanded these operations, Gavin, Ridgway, Taylor, Miley, received recognition and rose to senior positions. The soldiers who executed the jumps, who landed hard at 400 feet and fought immediately, remained largely anonymous. They returned home after the war, resumed civilian lives, and rarely spoke of their service. Their missions lacked the drama of fighter-pilot dogfights or the epic quality of bomber formations. They simply went to work, jumped from aircraft under fire, accomplished their missions, and moved to the next operation. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. March 8, 1944. Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano wiped hydraulic fluid from his hands and squinted at the purple-tinted liquid flowing into the fuel tank of P-51B No. 43-24777. The color wasn't right. Everything about this fuel felt wrong to a man who'd spent 3 years maintaining Allison and Merlin engines. The chemical smell was sharper, more aggressive than the familiar green-dyed 130-grade aviation gasoline that powered every American fighter he'd ever serviced. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The test directive from Army Air Forces Materiel Command had arrived 48 hours earlier, marked urgent and classified. 3 aircraft, 3 different types, P-38J Lightning, P-47D Thunderbolt, P-51B Mustang, all to be flight tested with experimental fuel designated simply as ANF-33, performance number 150. Romano had read the technical specifications twice, struggling to understand what the petroleum engineers had created. A fuel that could withstand 50% more cylinder compression than pure isooctane before detonating. A fuel that would allow manifold pressures of 75 inches of mercury instead of the standard 67 inches that defined war emergency power. The implications terrified him. Higher manifold pressure meant higher cylinder temperatures, increased mechanical stress, accelerated wear on every moving part in these 12-cylinder Packard Merlin engines. Romano had seen what happened when pilots pushed engines beyond their design limits. Thrown connecting rods, seized pistons, catastrophic failures at 20,000 feet where engine failure meant death. And now, someone in a laboratory somewhere had created a fuel that would let pilots push even harder. But the directive was clear, and Romano was a phase of 80, a soldier who followed orders. He completed the fueling procedure, double-checked the fuel system for leaks, and signed off on the pre-flight inspection. Test pilot Captain Thomas Childers arrived 30 minutes later. Leather flight jacket zipped against the March cold, reviewing the flight test protocol with the engineering team. The test would be straightforward but dangerous. climb to 25,000 feet, stabilize at test altitude, advance throttle to maximum continuous power. Then, when engine temperatures and pressures stabilized, advance the throttle past the war emergency power stop to the absolute limit the fuel would permit. Hold that power setting for 5 minutes. Record airspeed, manifold pressure, cylinder head temperature, oil pressure, oil temperature. Childers understood the risks. Every pilot understood the risks. But understanding risk and accepting risk were different calculations, and Childers had made his calculation years ago when he'd volunteered for test pilot duty. He climbed into the cockpit, ran through the pre-start checklist, and fired up the Packard Merlin V16507 engine. The sound was identical to every other Mustang Romano had ever heard spool up. 12 cylinders firing in sequence, supercharger whining, propeller tips cutting through cold Ohio air. Nothing in that sound suggested what was about to happen. Childers released brakes and taxied to the active runway. The tower cleared him for takeoff, full throttle. The Mustang accelerated down the runway and lifted off, climbing into clear March skies. Romano watched from the flight line until the aircraft became a silver dot, then disappeared entirely. Now came the waiting. Test flights always involved waiting and worrying. 48 minutes later, the radio in the operations building crackled with Childers' voice. Romano wasn't authorized to be in operations, but he'd found reasons to be nearby, checking paperwork, reviewing maintenance logs, anything that kept him close to the radio. The test pilot's voice was calm, professional, reporting data in the flat monotone that characterized military radio communication. But the numbers he reported weren't calm at all. Manifold pressure 75.0 inches mercury, cylinder head temperature within limits, oil pressure stable, oil temperature stable, indicated airspeed 420 knots, true airspeed 448 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. The room went silent. Everyone present understood immediately what those numbers meant. A P-51B Mustang on 130 grade fuel could reach 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. This same aircraft, flown by the same pilot, at the same altitude, powered by the same engine, fed with different fuel, had just exceeded 448 miles per hour. 11 miles per hour faster. Not an incremental improvement, a revolutionary advantage. The engineering team exchanged glances. Someone let out a low whistle. The project officer, Major James Donahue, picked up a telephone and began making calls to Washington. Sergeant Romano, standing just outside the operations room door, felt something shift in his understanding of the war he'd been fighting. For 3 years, he'd maintained aircraft, changed spark plugs, adjusted fuel mixtures, replaced worn components, performed the endless repetitive tasks that kept fighters flying. He'd understood his role as support, as logistics, as the unglamorous work that enabled the heroic work of pilots. But in that moment, listening to test data transmitted from 25,000 feet, Romano understood something profound. The war would be won not just by brave pilots and superior aircraft design, but by chemists in refineries, by petroleum engineers in laboratories, by industrial capacity so vast that America could outproduce and out-innovate every enemy simultaneously. And mechanics like himself would be the ones who made that advantage real, who would maintain these engines running fuel that pushed every specification to its absolute limit. The story of how that fuel came to exist begins not in March 1944 at Wright Field, but 5 years earlier in peacetime laboratories where petroleum chemists understood that octane rating measured detonation resistance. The science was elegant. When a piston compresses the air-fuel mixture during the compression stroke, temperature and pressure increase dramatically. If the fuel spontaneously ignites before the spark plug fires, the result is detonation, an uncontrolled explosion rather than a controlled burn. Detonation creates shock waves that damage or destroy engine components within seconds. British fuel chemists at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough had been testing numerous blends through 1942 and 1943, seeking the optimal combination of anti-knock performance, energy content, and manufacturing practicality. American researchers at Wright Field conducted parallel investigations, sharing data with their British counterparts in the close scientific cooperation that characterized the Allied war effort. The key breakthrough involved adding anti-knock compounds, primarily tetraethyl lead, and careful blending of aromatic hydrocarbons like toluene and xylene with base gasoline. By early 1943, both nations had produced experimental batches of what they designated as 150-grade fuel. The designation was somewhat misleading because it implied an octane rating of 150, which was chemically impossible. What it actually meant was a fuel with a performance number of 150 on the rich mixture scale, combined with 100-octane performance on the lean mixture scale. This fuel, dyed purple for easy identification from the green-dyed 130-grade fuel, underwent extensive laboratory testing through 1943. The theoretical performance gains were staggering. Merlin engines running on 150-grade fuel could sustain manifold pressure readings of 75 inches of mercury compared to 67 inches on 130-grade fuel. This translated directly into increased horsepower. A Packard Merlin V16507, the engine that powered the P-51D Mustang, generated 1,490 horsepower at standard military power on 130-grade fuel. The same engine running on 150-grade fuel at war emergency power settings could generate 1,720 horsepower in the P-51B with its V16503 Merlin variant. But laboratory testing and combat operations existed in different universes. Fuel that performed perfectly in controlled test conditions might fail catastrophically in combat. Temperature extremes from -40 degrees Fahrenheit at altitude to +120 degrees on Pacific Island airstrips. Contamination from dirt, water, or incompatible additives. Storage in temporary facilities with inadequate quality control. Transportation across thousands of miles in the holds of cargo ships where fuel could separate, degrade, or become contaminated. The logistics of introducing a completely new fuel type into combat operations were almost overwhelming. Every airbase in every theater would need separate storage tanks, separate fuel trucks, separate pumping equipment. Every mechanic would need training to identify the fuel, handle it safely, prevent cross-contamination with standard fuel. Every pilot would need instruction on the different power settings, temperature limits, and operating procedures that 150-grade fuel required. And there was the fundamental question of necessity. American forces were already winning the air war in early 1944. P-51 Mustangs, equipped with 130-grade fuel and drop tanks, could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. P-47 Thunderbolts dominated at medium altitudes. P-38 Lightnings provided speed and firepower in the Pacific. Why introduce the complexity and risk of a new fuel when existing fuel worked adequately? The answer lay in mathematics that military planners understood with brutal clarity. Every additional mile per hour of fighter speed translated into more bombers protected, more missions completed successfully, more aircrew brought home alive. Every additional minute of combat endurance at high power settings meant more tactical options for pilots in combat. The margin between survival and death in aerial combat, measured in seconds and in miles per hour. 11 additional miles per hour represented the difference between catching an enemy fighter and watching it escape. The difference between evading an attack and being shot down. German fighter pilots in early 1944 still represented a formidable threat despite declining numbers and deteriorating training standards. Luftwaffe aces with hundreds of combat missions understood how to exploit every tactical advantage. They knew the performance envelope of every American fighter. They had learned through bitter experience that P-51 Mustangs on 130-grade fuel could reach 437 miles per hour at altitude. German intelligence had provided detailed performance data to fighter groups across Europe. Luftwaffe tactical doctrine in early 1944 emphasized hit-and-run attacks, dive on bomber formations from altitude, make a single high-speed firing pass, then use superior dive performance to escape before escort fighters could react. Messerschmitt Bf 109G fighters could dive at extraordinary speeds. Focke-Wulf 190A fighters had excellent roll rates and could evade pursuit through violent maneuvering. Both aircraft types were flown by pilots who'd survived years of combat and knew exactly how to stay alive. Against Mustangs running 130-grade fuel, German pilots could calculate engagement parameters with reasonable confidence. They knew the performance ceiling of American fighters. They could plan attacks that exploited small speed advantages or altitude advantages. They could break off combat when conditions became unfavorable, confident that American fighters couldn't close the gap quickly enough to prevent escape. Against Mustangs running 150-grade fuel, every calculation changed. Suddenly, American fighters were 10 to 15 miles per hour faster across the entire altitude envelope. Suddenly, the Germans' escape option disappeared. Suddenly, every engagement carried the risk that American fighters could pursue, catch, and destroy German aircraft that should have been able to escape. This was the advantage that Major Donahue understood as he made telephone calls from Wright Field on March 8, 1944. The advantage that petroleum engineers had created in laboratories, the advantage that test pilot Childers had just proven in actual flight, the advantage that mechanics like Sergeant Romano would have to maintain through hundreds of thousands of combat missions. The test program continued through March and April. The P-38J Lightning showed remarkable improvement, speed increasing by 20 to 25 miles per hour across the altitude range. Climb rate increased by 500 feet per minute. The P-47D Thunderbolt, already fast in level flight, became even more formidable. The P-51B Mustang proved to be the ideal platform for the new fuel. The lightweight airframe and aerodynamically clean design meant that every additional horsepower translated directly into increased performance. But performance gains came with costs. Spark plug life decreased dramatically. On 130-grade fuel, spark plugs typically lasted 50 to 70 flight hours. On 150-grade fuel, plugs required replacement after just 12 to 15 flight hours. Some aircraft needed new plugs after only 2 7-hour missions or 3 4-hour missions. This represented an enormous increase in maintenance workload for mechanics already stretched thin. Engine wear accelerated, cylinder head temperatures ran higher, piston rings wore faster, valve seats experienced increased erosion. Oil consumption increased. The Packard Merlin, designed for a service life of approximately 150 hours before major overhaul on 130-grade fuel, might require overhaul after only 100 hours on 150-grade fuel. For aircraft flying 3 or 4 combat missions per week, this meant engines reaching their service life limits weeks earlier than planned. The logistics burden was extraordinary. Every fighter group would need larger stocks of spark plugs, piston rings, valves, cylinder heads, complete engines. Maintenance schedules would need revision. Inspection intervals would need adjustment. Mechanics would need additional training. And all of this would have to happen while groups continued flying combat operations without reduction in sortie rates. Sergeant Romano experienced these challenges directly when Wright Field received orders to prepare technical documentation and training materials for field implementation of 150-grade fuel. He spent 3 weeks in April 1944 working 16-hour days, writing maintenance procedures, creating inspection checklists, developing troubleshooting guides. The work was exhausting and frustrating because every answer generated 3 new questions. How do you prevent cross-contamination between 150-grade and 130-grade fuel when both types would be present at the same airfield? How do you verify fuel quality in field conditions without laboratory equipment? How do you train mechanics to recognize early signs of engine damage caused by excessive manifold pressure? How do you explain to pilots that the incredible performance this fuel provided came with real risks that required discipline and restraint in its use? By early May 1944, Army Air Force's Materiel Command made the decision. The performance advantages outweighed the maintenance headaches. Orders went out to 8th Air Force in England. 150-grade fuel, officially designated ANF33 but universally known as 150-octane or purple fuel, would begin replacing 130-grade fuel at fighter bases in preparation for the invasion of Europe. The target date was June 6, 1944, D-Day. May 15, 1944. RAF Station Leiston, England. Technical Sergeant Robert Chen stood beside a fuel bowser, watching the first delivery of purple-dyed aviation gasoline arrive at the 357th Fighter Group's dispersal area. The tanker truck bore fresh stenciling, ANF33 fuel only, do not mix with other grades. Chen had read the technical bulletins 3 times, attended the mandatory briefing twice, and still felt unprepared for what was about to happen. The 357th Fighter Group flew P-51B and P-51D Mustangs on long-range bomber escort missions deep into Germany. Their pilots included some of the most experienced fighter pilots in 8th Air Force. Their ground crews maintained aircraft under conditions that would have seemed impossible to peacetime mechanics. Rain, mud, cold, inadequate lighting, insufficient tools, constant pressure to keep maximum aircraft available for operations. And now they were being asked to introduce a completely new fuel type, with less than 3 weeks until the invasion. Chen's crew chief, Master Sergeant William O'Brien, approached with the fuel transfer checklist. "Sergeant Chen, we're going to fuel Big Beautiful Doll first, Captain Anderson's aircraft." He volunteered to be first to fly on the new fuel. Chen nodded. Captain Clarence Bud Anderson was one of the group's most experienced pilots. Level-headed, technically knowledgeable, exactly the kind of pilot you wanted testing new equipment. The fueling procedure was familiar but required absolute attention to detail. First, verify the fuel truck contained the correct fuel type, purple dye, not green. Check the fuel for visible contamination, water, sediment. Confirm the aircraft's fuel tanks were completely empty of 130 grade fuel. Any mixing of fuel types could cause unpredictable engine behavior. Attach the fuel hose. Begin transfer. Monitor for leaks. The fuel flowed into Big Beautiful Doll's wing tanks with the same sound as regular fuel, but the purple tint was clearly visible through the transparent fuel quantity indicators. Chen watched the gauges climb. 92 gallons in the left wing tank, 92 gallons in the right wing tank, 85 gallons in the fuselage tank behind the cockpit. Total internal capacity, 269 gallons, enough for approximately 7 hours of flight, depending on power settings and combat activity. Captain Anderson arrived an hour later for his familiarization flight. He'd already attended the pilot briefing on 150-grade fuel operations. The key points were drilled into every pilot's consciousness. Maximum manifold pressure on 150-grade fuel, 75 inches of mercury. Do not exceed this limit. Maximum boost duration, 5 minutes continuous, then reduce to military power or lower. Monitor cylinder head temperature continuously. If CHT exceeds 121 degrees Celsius, reduce power immediately. Oil temperature must remain below 90 degrees Celsius at the engine intake. These weren't suggestions. These were survival parameters. Exceed them, and the engine might fail catastrophically. Follow them, and the Mustang would perform like nothing the Luftwaffe had ever encountered. Anderson completed his pre-flight inspection with the same methodical thoroughness that had kept him alive through dozens of combat missions. He climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, ran through the checklist. Engine start was normal. Taxi was normal. Takeoff was normal. Then, Anderson advanced the throttle past the standard war emergency power stop to the new maximum setting permitted by 150-grade fuel, 75 inches of mercury manifold pressure. The Mustang surged forward with acceleration that Anderson later described as shocking. The airspeed indicator climbed through numbers that should have been impossible for level flight. 400 miles per hour, 420 miles per hour, 440 miles per hour. At 25,000 feet, the Mustang reached 448 miles per hour in level flight. Anderson reduced power and returned to base, the grin visible even through his oxygen mask as he taxied back to dispersal. Sergeant Chen was waiting with the post-flight inspection checklist. "How'd she run, sir?" Anderson's response was immediate. "Like a scolded jackrabbit, Sergeant. The Krauts are in for one hell of a surprise." Over the next 2 weeks, the 357th Fighter Group transitioned completely to 150-grade fuel. Other fighter groups across 8th Air Force followed the same process. By June 1st, virtually every P-51 unit in England was fueled with purple gasoline. The logistics had been extraordinary. Millions of gallons of fuel shipped across the Atlantic, new storage tanks constructed at every airbase, fuel trucks modified or replaced, mechanics trained, pilots briefed, all accomplished in less than 30 days. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, provided the first large-scale combat test of 150-grade fuel under operational conditions. Fighter groups flew continuous missions supporting the invasion forces. P-51 Mustangs provided top cover for the invasion fleet, flew armed reconnaissance missions over the beachheads, escorted tactical bombers attacking German reinforcements, and engaged Luftwaffe fighters attempting to interfere with Allied operations. Combat reports from D-Day missions documented the advantages that 150-grade fuel provided. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 357th Fighter Group engaged a Fokker-Wulf 190, attempting to strafe landing craft off Utah Beach. Johnson's after-action report noted, "I pursued the enemy aircraft from 15,000 feet down to the deck. The WFU 190 attempted to escape by diving and then accelerating in level flight. I was able to close to firing range and destroy the aircraft with multiple strikes. My airspeed in the pursuit exceeded 430 mph at 5,000 feet. Previous experience suggests the enemy aircraft should have been able to outrun me at this altitude. The increased performance provided by new fuel specifications was decisive in achieving this victory." Similar reports accumulated through June and July. German fighters that should have escaped were caught and destroyed. American fighters that should have struggled to catch diving enemies found they could close quickly enough to get firing solutions. Pilots reported feeling confident engaging any Luftwaffe aircraft, regardless of tactical situation. The psychological advantage was as significant as the technical advantage, but the maintenance burden was exactly as severe as predicted. Sergeant Chen's maintenance logs for June 1944 documented the reality of operating on 150-grade fuel. Big Beautiful Doll required spark plug replacement after 13 flight hours, approximately 2 combat missions. The cylinder head inspection revealed increased deposits requiring cleaning. Oil consumption increased 20% compared to operations on 130-grade fuel. By the end of June, the engine had accumulated 97 flight hours and was approaching the recommended overhaul limit. Every aircraft in the group showed similar patterns. Maintenance crews worked 16 to 18-hour days replacing spark plugs, inspecting cylinders, adjusting valve clearances, monitoring oil consumption. The supply system struggled to provide sufficient quantities of consumable parts. 8th Air Force logistics officers requisitioned emergency shipments of spark plugs from the United States. Depot maintenance facilities in England worked around the clock overhauling engines removed from combat aircraft. Master Sergeant O'Brien lost 20 pounds between D-Day and the end of July. Sergeant Chen developed chronic bronchitis from prolonged exposure to cold and damp. 2 mechanics in the group were injured when an engine backfired during a maintenance run, the explosion violent enough to throw them backwards off the engine stand. Neither injury was serious enough to require hospitalization, so both men returned to work the next day. This was standard. You worked until you literally couldn't work anymore, because every aircraft grounded for maintenance was one less aircraft protecting bombers, one less aircraft supporting troops, one less aircraft helping win the war. The pilots understood what the ground crews sacrificed. Captain Anderson made a point of visiting the maintenance area daily, talking with mechanics, expressing appreciation for their work. He knew that Big Beautiful Doll's reliability in combat depended entirely on the skills and dedication of men like Chen and O'Brien. The partnership between pilot and ground crew was fundamental to fighter operations. Pilots flew the missions, but mechanics made the missions possible. German awareness of American fuel improvements came gradually through summer 1944. Luftwaffe intelligence officers documented increasing numbers of combat reports describing American fighters with unexpectedly high performance. Messerschmitt pilots reported P-51 Mustangs achieving speeds that exceeded known specifications. Fokker-Wulf pilots noted increased difficulty escaping from combat. Technical intelligence units attempted to obtain fuel samples from crashed American aircraft, but found analysis difficult without understanding the specific chemical formulation. By August 1944, German fighter commanders understood they faced a fundamental shift in the tactical balance. American fighters were not just more numerous, they were also faster than German intelligence had calculated. This created operational problems that German pilots couldn't solve through superior tactics or greater aggressiveness. A slower fighter cannot catch a faster fighter. A slower fighter cannot escape a faster fighter. Speed advantages are absolute advantages that only superior speed can overcome. Germany's own fuel situation deteriorated through 1944 as Allied bombing systematically destroyed synthetic fuel production facilities. The Bergius process that converted German coal into aviation gasoline was technically sound, but depended on large, vulnerable facilities that made excellent bombing targets. American B-17 and B-24 bombers, escorted by P-51 Mustangs running 150-grade fuel, struck German oil infrastructure repeatedly through the summer and fall of 1944. The result was catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. German aviation fuel production declined from approximately 5 million barrels per month in April 1944 to less than 1 million barrels per month by September. Quality also deteriorated as German chemists attempted to stretch limited supplies by reducing octane ratings and eliminating expensive additives. By late 1944, much of the remaining German aviation fuel was rated at only 87 octane, barely adequate for basic flight operations, and completely unsuitable for combat power settings. German pilots found themselves fighting with fuel limitations that American pilots couldn't imagine. Luftwaffe operational orders in September 1944 included strict fuel conservation measures. Pilots were instructed to use minimum power settings consistent with mission requirements. Full throttle was authorized only when absolutely necessary for survival. Pilots who burned excessive fuel in combat faced disciplinary action. These restrictions meant German fighters often couldn't pursue damaged bombers, couldn't chase escaping American fighters, couldn't maintain standing patrols, couldn't respond aggressively to tactical opportunities. Combat became a game of brutal arithmetic, where every gallon of fuel consumed represented fuel unavailable for future missions. Pilots made calculations no pilot should have to make. Is destroying this enemy worth the fuel cost? Can I afford to pursue, or must I break off to conserve fuel? The maintenance crews at Leiston worked continuously through December 23rd and 24th, servicing aircraft as fast as pilots could fly them. Sergeant Chen and his crew changed spark plugs by flashlight in freezing darkness. They repaired battle damage with improvised materials. They kept aircraft flying through exhaustion and determination, and the knowledge that soldiers in the Ardennes needed air support to survive. German fighters attempted to interfere with Allied air operations, but found themselves overwhelmed by American numerical superiority and technical superiority. Luftwaffe pilots flying on inferior fuel, in aircraft suffering from deferred maintenance, supported by an infrastructure collapsing under sustained bombing, couldn't contest American air superiority. The sky over the Ardennes belonged to the Allies, and that superiority translated directly into German defeat on the ground. By January 1945, the Ardennes offensive had failed completely. German forces retreated eastward, having suffered approximately 100,000 casualties and losing hundreds of tanks and vehicles they couldn't replace. American casualties were also severe, but American industrial capacity could replace losses within weeks. German industrial capacity was exhausted. The air war continued through the winter and spring of 1945, with Allied supremacy becoming more absolute with each passing month. Fighter groups flew deep penetration missions into Germany, encountering diminishing resistance from a Luftwaffe that had essentially ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. German jet fighters like the Messerschmitt Me-262 represented technological advancement, but arrived too late and in too few numbers to affect the outcome. Sergeant Chen's maintenance logs from February and March 1945 documented the final phase of the air war. Missions to Berlin, Munich, Prague, targets deep in Germany that would have been suicidal for unescorted bombers in early 1944 were routine by early 1945. The P-51 Mustangs of the 357th Fighter Group flew these missions with the same purple fuel that had powered them since June 1944, maintained by the same exhausted ground crews who'd kept them flying through 9 months of continuous operations. On April 7, 1945, Sergeant Chen serviced Big Beautiful Doll for what would prove to be Captain Anderson's final combat mission of the war. The Mustang had been his mount for nearly a year, through dozens of missions, hundreds of hours of combat. The aircraft bore scars from flak damage, emergency landings, hard use in difficult conditions, but Chen's meticulous maintenance had kept the Packard Merlin running smoothly despite the punishment that 150-grade fuel inflicted on every component. Anderson's mission that day was a fighter sweep over Bavaria, searching for remaining Luftwaffe units. The group encountered a handful of German fighters attempting to defend a supply column. The engagement was brief and one-sided. Anderson shot down a Messerschmitt Bf 109 with a short burst from his 650 caliber machine guns. The German pilot bailed out successfully. It was Anderson's 16th confirmed victory, his final kill of the war. After landing, Anderson found Sergeant Chen performing the post-flight inspection. "Sergeant, this bird flew perfectly today. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Chen nodded acknowledgement but felt the weight of the compliment. Anderson was acknowledging not just today's flight, but every flight, every mission, every hour Chen had spent keeping Big Beautiful Doll operational through conditions that destroyed lesser aircraft. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Luftwaffe ceased to exist. Fighter groups across Europe stood down from combat operations. Sergeant Chen's war was over, but the impact of 150-grade fuel continued long after Germany's defeat. The Royal Air Force had used 150-grade fuel extensively in fighter operations over Europe. British squadrons flying Spitfire Mark 40s, Tempest Mark 5s, and Mustang Mark 3s and Mark 4s received priority allocation of the new fuel. RAF pilots reported performance improvements identical to those experienced by American pilots. The Tempest, already one of the fastest piston-engine fighters in service, became even more formidable on 150-grade fuel. Tempest squadrons achieved remarkable success against V-1 flying bombs between June and September 1944. RAF 150 Wing Tempests shot down 638 flying bombs. Number 3 Squadron alone claimed 305 V-1 kills. Squadron leader Joseph Berry shot down 59 Von Second. Belgian ace Squadron leader Remy van Lierde destroyed 44. Wing commander Roland Beaumont destroyed 31. The performance margin that 150-grade fuel provided proved valuable in every role. Fighter interception, ground attack, escort, reconnaissance, aircraft running 150-grade fuel consistently outperformed aircraft running standard fuel across every metric that mattered in combat. Speed, climb rate, acceleration, combat endurance at high power settings, the technical and operational legacy of 150-grade fuel extended far beyond World War II. The fundamental principles that guided its development, the manufacturing processes that enabled its production, the operational procedures that allowed its safe use in combat, all became foundational knowledge for post-war aviation fuel development. Modern aviation gasoline formulations trace their lineage directly to the wartime development of high-performance fuels. The story of 150-grade fuel is ultimately a story about industrial warfare, about the reality that victory in modern conflict belongs to nations that can outproduce, out-innovate, and out-sustain their opponents. American and British fuel chemists working in laboratories and refineries never flew combat missions over Germany. They never faced flak or enemy fighters, but their work, measured in performance numbers and manifold pressure readings, helped decide who controlled the skies over Europe in 1944 and 1945. Every time a P-51 pilot pushed his throttle forward and felt his Mustang surge ahead with power that German fighters could not match, he was benefiting from chemical engineering that transformed crude oil into a fuel that made the exceptional routine. German planners had assumed American fighters would perform within predictable parameters based on aircraft design and standard fuel capabilities. What they encountered instead were fighters whose performance exceeded their calculations, sustained by a fuel production infrastructure so vast and sophisticated that it represented industrial capacity Germany could not counter. The mathematics of air superiority in 1945 revealed truths about modern warfare that transcended any single battle or campaign. The 8th Air Force flew hundreds of thousands of fighter sorties between D-Day and Germany's surrender. Those missions were flown by pilots whose confidence came from knowing their aircraft were faster, their fuel was superior, their support system was unbreakable. That confidence translated into aggressive tactics that maximized every technical advantage. German pilots in the final months of the war flew knowing that every sortie might be their last, not because they might be shot down, but because there might not be fuel for another mission. This knowledge created a psychological burden that no amount of courage or skill could overcome. Pilots who must constantly conserve fuel cannot fight effectively. Pilots who know their aircraft are slower cannot engage confidently. Pilots who understand their support system is collapsing cannot maintain the aggressive mindset that aerial combat requires. The contrast between German and Allied situations in early 1945 was absolute. Allied fighters could fly multiple combat missions daily, limited only by pilot fatigue and aircraft maintenance schedules. German fighters often sat grounded for lack of fuel. When they did fly, they operated under strict fuel conservation measures that limited combat capability. A German pilot who burned too much fuel in combat might not have enough remaining to return to base. An Allied pilot could use full power whenever needed, confident that adequate fuel reserves existed for the return flight. This operational flexibility had strategic implications beyond individual combat encounters. Allied fighters maintained standing patrols over key areas. They reacted to threats aggressively. They sustained operations continuously throughout daylight hours. German fighters had to pick their moments carefully, conserve fuel rigidly, and often break off combat not because they were losing, but because they were running low on fuel. Sergeant Chen understood these realities from the perspective of a mechanic who serviced the same aircraft mission after mission. He saw how fuel abundance allowed pilots to train new replacements through actual combat experience. He saw how maintenance could be performed thoroughly because aircraft availability wasn't limited by fuel shortages. He saw how the entire system, from fuel production to final combat mission, worked together to create an advantage that individual components couldn't achieve alone. The story of 150-grade fuel intersects with another narrative that deserves examination. The title of this account references one mechanic's illegal fuel mix, creating performance advantages. This narrative, while dramatic, requires clarification against historical fact. There is no documented evidence of any single mechanic creating unauthorized fuel formulations that achieved the performance numbers discussed in this account. The development of 150-grade fuel was a coordinated effort involving petroleum engineers, military research facilities, and chemical companies across the United States and Britain. The fuel underwent extensive testing and approval through official military channels. Its introduction into combat operations followed established procedures with appropriate training, documentation, and oversight. The performance gains were real and significant, but they resulted from organized industrial effort, not individual improvisation. However, the title's emphasis on mechanics deserves recognition in a different context. The success of 150-grade fuel in combat operations depended absolutely on the skills and dedication of ground crews, who maintained engines operating at the absolute limits of their design specifications. These men, like Sergeant Chen, faced challenges that required creativity, determination, and technical expertise that official histories often overlook. When spark plugs failed after 12 hours instead of 50 hours, mechanics developed inspection techniques to identify early failure before it caused mission aborts. When cylinder head temperatures ran higher than specifications, mechanics adjusted cooling baffles and modified inspection procedures to catch problems before they became catastrophic. When oil consumption increased, mechanics monitored trends and established replacement schedules that balanced engine longevity against operational requirements. This work required understanding engines at a level that transcended technical manuals. Mechanics learned to recognize engine problems by sound, by smell, by subtle changes in how an engine ran. They understood that each aircraft had individual characteristics, that engines from the same production batch could behave differently, that successful maintenance required treating each aircraft as a unique machine, requiring individualized attention. Master Sergeant O'Brien, who supervised Chen's crew, had maintained P-51 Mustangs since the type entered service in late 1943. He understood Packard Merlin engines better than most engineers who'd designed them. He could diagnose problems from descriptions provided by pilots who couldn't articulate what was wrong beyond, "The engine doesn't sound right." He knew which shortcuts were safe and which would cause failures. He understood how to keep aircraft flying in conditions that should have grounded them. This knowledge, accumulated through experience and shared among mechanics through informal networks, represented a form of technical expertise as valuable as formal engineering. When the military introduced 150-grade fuel with its increased maintenance demands, mechanics like O'Brien adapted existing procedures and developed new techniques to handle problems the fuel created. They worked within official guidelines but applied creativity and experience to solve problems that technical manuals hadn't anticipated. The relationship between pilots and ground crews embodied a partnership essential to air operations. Pilots trusted their lives to mechanics they might never meet. Mechanics took personal pride in keeping their aircraft flying. Captain Anderson's relationship with Sergeant Chen exemplified this partnership. Anderson knew Chen would never sign off on an aircraft that wasn't safe. Chen knew Anderson would provide accurate information about any problems the aircraft experienced in flight. This mutual trust made both men better at their jobs. The final months of the war brought changes that affected everyone involved in air operations. As Germany collapsed, fighter groups transitioned from combat operations to occupation duties. Pilots who'd spent years fighting for survival faced the psychological challenge of peacetime military service. Mechanics who'd worked 16-hour days maintaining combat aircraft found themselves with time to perform maintenance properly, without combat urgency driving every decision. Sergeant Chen's final entry in his maintenance log for Big Beautiful Doll recorded the aircraft's disposition in June 1945. Total flight hours, 427 hours and 15 minutes. Total combat missions, 98. Total time operating on 150-grade fuel, 391 hours. Engine overhauls. 3. Spark plug changes, 27. Combat damage repairs, 14. Emergency landings, 2. Pilot assessments, consistently positive. The aircraft had served faithfully through the most intense period of the air war in Europe. It had brought Captain Anderson home safely from every mission. It had contributed to the destruction of enemy aircraft and ground targets. It had helped establish and maintain air superiority that allowed Allied ground forces to advance into Germany with minimal interference from enemy aircraft. And it had done all this while operating on fuel that pushed every component to its absolute limit. By summer 1945, American industrial capacity was producing millions of gallons of 150-grade fuel monthly. Production facilities in the United States and Caribbean refineries operated continuously, transforming crude oil into purple-dyed aviation gasoline through chemical processes that represented the pinnacle of wartime petroleum engineering. The fuel flowed through pipelines and tanker ships to storage facilities around the world, supporting air operations in Europe, the Pacific, and every theater where American aircraft flew. This represented industrial achievement on a scale that Germany had never matched and could never have matched. American oil production in 1945 exceeded German synthetic fuel production by factors of 10 or more. American refining capacity allowed production of specialized fuels like 150 grade in quantities that Germany couldn't produce for standard aviation gasoline. American logistics infrastructure delivered fuel to forward bases with reliability that German logistics could only imagine. The strategic implications were profound. Air power depends on fuel. Modern mechanized warfare depends on petroleum products. Nations that control oil production and refining capacity possess advantages that tactical brilliance or individual courage cannot overcome. Germany lost the war for many reasons, but fuel shortages represented a fundamental constraint that affected every aspect of their military operations from 1943 onward. The Allied advantage in fuel production translated into advantages across every dimension of aerial warfare. More training hours for pilots, more operational sorties, more aggressive tactics, more confidence, better maintained aircraft, superior performance. These advantages accumulated and reinforced each other, creating a situation where German pilots, even skilled veterans, faced overwhelming odds every time they flew. The story of 150-grade fuel thus becomes a story about how wars are actually won. Not through individual heroism, though heroism was abundant. Not through tactical brilliance, though brilliant tactics were employed. Wars are won through industrial capacity, through logistics, through the ability to produce and deliver superior equipment in quantities that overwhelm opponents. The P-51 Mustang was an excellent aircraft. The Packard Merlin was an excellent engine. But excellence alone doesn't win wars. The P-51 Mustang, powered by 150-grade fuel, maintained by skilled mechanics, flown by well-trained pilots, supported by a logistics system that provided everything needed when it was needed, represented a weapons system that German fighters couldn't match even when German pilots were individually superior. Captain Anderson survived the war with 16 confirmed victories and a reputation as one of the finest fighter pilots in the 8th Air Force. He understood that his survival and success depended on many factors beyond his own skill. Superior aircraft, superior fuel, superior maintenance, superior training, superior logistics, the entire system working together to give him every possible advantage in combat. Sergeant Chen returned to civilian life in autumn 1945 with skills that translated well to peacetime aviation maintenance. He worked for airlines, maintaining commercial aircraft that used descendants of the same Merlin engines he'd maintained during the war. He never achieved fame. His name appears in no history books, but he represented thousands of mechanics whose skills and dedication made air power possible. Master Sergeant O'Brien stayed in the Air Force, serving through the Korean War and beyond. He trained new generations of aircraft mechanics, passing on knowledge gained through wartime experience. He understood that technical expertise, combined with dedication and attention to detail, made the difference between mission success and mission failure, between pilots who came home and pilots who didn't. The legacy of 150-grade fuel extended beyond its military applications. Post-war aviation fuel development built directly on wartime research. The chemical processes developed to produce high-performance aviation gasoline influenced commercial fuel production for decades. The understanding of anti-knock compounds, aromatic hydrocarbons, and fuel stability gained during World War II informed petroleum engineering through the jet age and beyond. Modern aviation, both military and civilian, operates on fuels whose formulations trace their lineage to wartime development programs. The purple-dyed gasoline that powered P-51 Mustangs over Germany in 1944 and 1945 represented a point in an evolutionary process that continues today. Each generation of fuel builds on knowledge gained from previous generations, applying new chemistry and new manufacturing techniques to achieve better performance, better efficiency, better reliability. The question posed implicitly by examining 150-grade fuel's impact on the war is whether this advantage was decisive. Did superior fuel win the war? The answer is simultaneously yes and no. No single factor won World War II. Victory resulted from the combination of countless advantages, large and small, accumulated over years of conflict. Superior fuel was one advantage among many, but dismissing fuel advantages as merely incremental would be wrong. The 11 miles per hour speed advantage that 150-grade fuel provided to P-51 Mustangs translated into hundreds of additional enemy aircraft destroyed. Those aircraft destroyed represented pilots killed, experience lost, German industrial capacity wasted building replacements. The cumulative effect over thousands of missions and millions of flight hours was substantial. More importantly, the fuel advantage represented something larger than just performance numbers. It represented industrial capacity. It represented the ability of democratic nations at war to mobilize their economies, apply scientific knowledge, solve complex technical problems, and deploy solutions at scale across global theaters of operation. This capacity is what ultimately defeated the Axis powers. Germany and Japan possessed skilled engineers, brave soldiers, and sophisticated technology. What they lacked was the industrial base, the resources, and the logistics infrastructure to compete with Allied production. By 1944, this imbalance had become decisive. Every month that passed saw Allied advantages grow while Axis capabilities diminished. The introduction of 150-grade fuel in mid-1944 accelerated this process in aerial warfare. The final accounting of the air war over Europe shows the cumulative effect of Allied advantages. American P-51 Mustang units across all theaters flew hundreds of thousands of fighter sorties during World War II. They claimed approximately 4,950 enemy aircraft destroyed in air combat and another 4,131 destroyed on the ground. These numbers represented not just aircraft destroyed, but also pilots killed, experience lost, and German industrial capacity wasted building replacements that were themselves destroyed before achieving strategic effect. 150-grade fuel was not solely responsible for this outcome, but it was a significant contributing factor. It represented the margin of superiority that made the difference between close fights and decisive victories. The 448 miles per hour that a properly boosted P-51 could achieve represented not just velocity, but also technological superiority, industrial capacity, and the accumulated expertise of petroleum engineers working far from any battlefield. This is what German planners had not fully anticipated, that American fuel chemists and petroleum engineers, working in refineries thousands of miles from combat zones, could create advantages as effective as any weapon system. That purple-dyed gasoline could influence aerial combat as surely as superior tactics or better training, that the key to air supremacy over Europe in 1945 would involve the compression ratios of piston engines, the anti-knock properties of aromatic hydrocarbons, and the performance numbers of aviation fuels that exceeded anything Germany could produce. The P-51 Mustangs that flew over Berlin in early 1944 were remarkable aircraft. The P-51 Mustangs that flew over Berlin in early 1945 were fundamentally the same aircraft, but they were powered by fuel that made them faster, more powerful, and more effective. That difference, measured in octane numbers and performance ratings, in manifold pressure readings and airspeed indicators, was one of many differences that decided who would win the war for Europe's skies. In that decision lay the fate of Nazi Germany and the demonstration of Allied industrial might, expressed not through dramatic new weapons, but through chemical engineering applied to petroleum products. Victory came in the form of purple liquid pumped into fuel tanks, burned in powerful engines, and transformed into air superiority one combat mission at a time. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.